Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
My brother has always had this way of making everything I do feel smaller than it is, like he's got some invisible measuring stick that only he understands, and no matter how far I think I've come, he'll find a way to tell me it's not that impressive. Jason is older by 3 years, and ever since we were kids, the dynamic was set. He was the golden boy who never seemed to try too hard, but always landed on his feet, and I was the one grinding in the background, putting in late nights and chasing things that, in his opinion, were just phases or cute little projects. So when I told my family that after 2 years of work I was finally launching my product, something I'd poured savings, time, and frankly my sanity into, I didn't expect them to throw me a parade, but I did expect, at the very least, some enthusiasm. Instead, the night before my big day, Jason called me, and what started as a casual check-in quickly turned into one of those conversations that you know you're going to replay in your head 1,000 times because of the way it stung. He started with small talk, asked me about logistics, and then, in that tone he uses when he thinks he's being the voice of reason, but is actually just chipping away at your confidence, he said, "I think you might be overhyping this whole launch thing. Nobody really cares that much. Don't take it personally, it's just how it is." I tried to laugh it off, to treat it like one of those blunt but harmless comments, but something about the way he said, "nobody cares," made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just dismissive, it was final, like he'd already decided that what I was doing didn't matter, and there was nothing I could do to change his mind. I remember sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, looking at the clock, knowing I still had hours of prep ahead, and feeling this wave of heat in my chest, the kind that's half anger, half humiliation. It wasn't just him, either. Our family group chat had gone quiet when I'd mentioned the press briefing earlier in the week, and while no one said anything outright negative, the silence was almost worse. You can tell when people are politely waiting for you to fail so they don't have to pretend to be surprised. My parents, who adored Jason and still see him as the one who figured life out, didn't chime in with encouragement or questions. They just let his voice fill the space, like he was speaking for all of them. What I wanted to say in that moment was something sharp, something that would make him stop underestimating me, but I didn't. I took a slow breath, told him I had a lot to get done, and ended the call as calmly as I could. Not because I didn't have words, but because I realized right then that if I fought him on it, if I argued about how important this was, I'd be feeding the exact narrative he already believed, that I was desperate for validation. And I didn't want him, or anyone else, to feel like they were in the position to give it to me. After I hung up, I just sat there for a few minutes, letting the frustration settle into something more useful. I've learned over the years that anger, when you carry it right, can be an incredible motivator, and instead of wasting it on a back and forth that wouldn't change his mind, I decided I was going to channel every ounce of it into making sure that this launch didn't just go well, it went so well that he couldn't ignore it even if he tried. If Jason thought I was overhyping it, then I would make sure the actual outcome made my hype look modest. The truth was, I had been downplaying some of the details to the family, partly because I didn't want to jinx anything and partly because I wanted to keep the pressure off. I hadn't told them that I had a local news spot lined up, that a business columnist I knew had hinted at writing a piece, or that my team and I had been quietly building a campaign designed to hit hard in the first 24 hours. I figured it would be better to let them see the results than try to convince them of the potential. But now, after that call, it wasn't just about the business anymore, it was personal. It's funny how quickly your priorities can shift. Just hours earlier, I'd been worried about things like inventory numbers and whether the caterer would show up on time. Now, I was thinking about optics, about how to make sure that the right people were in the room and the right cameras were pointed in my direction when it mattered. I started running through the contact list in my head, thinking about who I could still invite without it seeming desperate, and who might be willing to give me a little extra visibility if I positioned it as a story worth telling. That night, instead of lying awake stressing, I stayed up and fine-tuned my plan. I made a couple of quiet calls, sent a few carefully worded emails, and locked in one last-minute element that, if it worked out, would give the whole event a very different energy. I didn't need Jason there to clap for me. I didn't need him to approve. But I was going to make damn sure that when the day was over, he'd have to live with the fact that he'd underestimated me in the most public way possible. By the time I shut my laptop in the early hours of the morning, I wasn't thinking about how much work it had taken to get here or how exhausted I was. I was thinking about that look Jason gets when he's caught off guard. If I could get even a hint of that through a phone screen, it would be worth every sleepless night I'd spend on this. And if he thought this launch was just about the product, he had no idea what I was actually about to do. The morning after that call with Jason, I woke up with the kind of clarity that doesn't come from rest, but from resolve, because once I'd decided I wasn't going to try to convince him or anyone else to believe in me, the whole launch stopped feeling like something I had to survive and started feeling like something I could weaponize, and not in a petty way that would burn bridges, but in a way that would leave no room for doubt about what I was capable of when I stopped asking for permission to be taken seriously. I already had the skeleton of a plan. The product was ready, the event space was booked, and the local TV station had confirmed they'd be sending a crew to do a short piece for their afternoon business segment. But I knew that if I wanted this to be more than just a nice clip for my website, I had to create a moment, something that would stick in people's minds long after the segment aired, something that would feel authentic enough to go viral without looking like I'd staged it for the sole purpose of proving someone wrong. So I started layering in elements that would make the whole thing impossible to ignore. First, I confirmed with my media contact that the segment would be live, not pre-recorded, which was a risk because it meant there'd be no safety net if I stumbled. But it also meant that whatever I said in those final seconds would go out exactly as I delivered it, without being softened or cut for time. Then I reached out to a few people who had a reason to be interested in what I was doing, but also had ties to circles that Jason paid attention to, not because I wanted him to feel surrounded, but because I wanted him to hear about the event from people other than me, people whose opinions he actually respected. The idea wasn't to rub it in his face directly, but to make sure the news reached him in a way that carried weight. At the same time, I deliberately kept my family in the dark about the scale of what was happening. In the group chat, I played it down, told them it would be a small, straightforward launch, nothing fancy, just me and a few local business owners, maybe a photographer if I could swing it. This wasn't about being dishonest, it was about preserving the element of surprise. I'd learned a long time ago that the less people know about your moves in advance, the harder it is for them to interfere or dismiss them before they happen. I also decided to invite one specific guest who had nothing to do with my product, but everything to do with Jason's ego, an ex-client of his who had publicly parted ways with him after a messy disagreement over a project. She had since built a thriving business of her own, and I knew her presence at my launch would raise eyebrows. I didn't plan on involving her in any drama, but I understood the optics. If she was seen supporting me, it would add another layer to the story without me having to say a word. The logistics started to snowball from there. I worked with the event coordinator to adjust the seating so the camera angles would capture not just me, but the reaction of the audience during key moments. I made sure the product displays were positioned in a way that would look good on TV without needing any heavy editing. I even prepped a few of my friends in the crowd to engage with me during the Q&A portion, not with fake questions, but with prompts I could use to lead into my final statement. It was a fine balance. I wanted it to feel organic, but I also wanted to guide the flow toward that one line I'd been holding in my head since the call with Jason. By the end of that day, my plan had shifted from make the launch successful to make the launch unforgettable, and every decision I made fed into that goal. I knew there was a chance it could all fall flat, that the cameras wouldn't catch the right moments, that the clip wouldn't get traction, that Jason wouldn't even bother to watch. But I also knew that if it did work, the impact would be far greater than just selling a product. It would rewrite the way people in my own family spoke about me, maybe not publicly, but in the quiet conversations they had when I wasn't in the room. The final piece fell into place that evening when I got a text from my media contact confirming that the station's social media team would be covering the event live on their Facebook and Instagram feeds. That meant there would be instant replay potential, the kind of thing that could be clipped and shared before the event was even over. I didn't tell anyone in my family about that either. Let them find out the same way everyone else would, by seeing it pop up in their feeds and realizing they'd underestimated me. The next morning, just a few hours before I had to head to the venue, Jason sent me a text that was almost laughable in its smugness. Good luck today. Don't be too disappointed if no one shows up. These things are always hit or miss. I stared at it for a moment, feeling that same tightness in my chest that I'd felt on the phone 2 nights earlier, but instead of responding, I just set my phone down and smiled. Because I knew that in less than 6 hours, the only thing hit or miss about this launch would be whether he decided to call me before or after the clip started making the rounds. I didn't need to reply. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't even need to think about what I'd say if he tried to downplay it afterward. All I needed to do was show up, deliver exactly what I'd planned, and let the rest take care of itself. And the truth was, I was more than ready. In a few hours, he was going to see exactly who showed up and exactly what they were there to witness. I arrived early enough to walk through the flow in my head and check that the people I needed were in place. Not because I wanted to micromanage every inch of it, but because I needed to know that when I stepped into that wide circle of attention, I would not be at the mercy of someone else's timing or judgment. And once I confirmed the crew had their live window, the social team had their captions ready, the event coordinator understood the order of questions, and my 2 friends knew exactly when to lift their hands, I finally let myself take a long breath and admit that this was not just a launch anymore. This was a statement I had been building for years without calling it that. When the producer clipped the tiny microphone to my collar and asked if I had a preferred closer, I said yes in a calm voice that did not match the pounding in my chest, and I watched her make a note because she understood that this was the line I would not let them cut. The interviewer was kind, the kind of professional who can guide a segment without stealing it, and as we waited for the countdown, I watched the small red light over the camera go dim to bright and felt the way that light turned the room into a funnel, everything narrowing until only my words mattered. We started with the basics, because that is what viewers expect, and I kept it simple and clear, explaining what the product does, why I built it, what problem it solves for everyday people who are tired of paying for complicated solutions that never fit real life. And while I spoke, I stayed anchored in the thought that I did not need to convince anyone who had already decided I was not worth taking seriously. I only needed to speak to the people who recognized themselves in the frustration I had lived with, and as soon as the first question landed about the origin story, I used the prompt I had planned with my friend to shift the frame from new thing on the market to creator with a spine. Because I knew that the product alone would not change the narrative, the posture would. The crowd reacted the way people do when they can tell a person is not hiding, a ripple of low sound and a few nods that were not dramatic but meant everything, and I could feel the interviewer lean in as if to say, keep going, you have them. Then the question I had hoped for arrived, the one about what it took to get here, and I did not dress it up because I did not owe anyone a pretty version of what the last 2 years were like, so I told the truth in tight, clean lines. That I ran on savings and favors, that I learned more about resilience from rejection emails than I ever did from compliments, that every time someone said maybe later it meant never unless I found a way to make later irrelevant. And while I kept my tone grounded, I let one detail hang in the air, that the hardest noise to push through did not come from strangers, but from people who were supposed to be on my side. And the interviewer's eyebrows shifted enough to show she understood the subtext and was willing to let it live in the segment without naming it. My friends in the audience did their part, one asking how I handled doubt and the other asking what I would say to someone who told me I was overhyping this, and those questions gave me the runway I needed without making it look staged, because they were the kinds of questions anyone could have asked if they had been listening closely. When the producer flashed the wrap sign, I knew I had exactly one breath to do the thing I came for, so I turned to the camera and, with my voice steady in that way it gets when I am done asking for space, I said that this moment was for me and not for the people who never believed. And I did not add another word, because the power was in the clean finish, and the quiet that followed was the kind that tells you a line landed exactly where you meant it to land. The interviewer handled the close with grace, thanking me and giving the product one last mention, and as the red light faded, I felt the odd mix of relief and adrenaline that comes when you hold your nerve in public and realize you did not flinch. The producer squeezed my shoulder and said, "Good hit," which is the kind of compliment that matters because it comes from someone who watches people miss all day. Within minutes, The station's social team had clipped the segment and posted it, and the first wave of comments was the usual mix of curiosity and skepticism. But then the line began to travel, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. And people who are tired of swallowing doubt recognized the taste of it, and my phone started buzzing in short bursts that became a steady tremor. Friends texted screen recordings, colleagues sent me screenshots of shares in private groups, and a woman I had never met messaged me to say she watched the clip at her desk and felt seen. And while I read those notes, I also watched our family chat sit in that strange limbo where people have seen the thing but do not know how to acknowledge it without admitting they were not cheering before it aired. The moment that told me we had broken out of the local bubble came not from a friend or a relative, but from an area code I did not recognize. A reporter at a larger network asking whether I could do a live conversation the next morning because their producer believed the segment captured something timely about creators who are done waiting for approval. And I said yes without looking at my calendar because I understood momentum and I was not going to slow it down to be polite. I checked my notifications out of habit and found that someone had tagged Jason under the clip with a line that was both playful and surgical, something like "looks like people care," and I will not lie, there was a small, private satisfaction in knowing he was probably seeing my name not because I sent it to him, but because other people did, which is a different kind of proof. What I did not do was text him, because I was no longer interested in asking him to understand me, and because I had another small piece of the plan still unfolding in the room itself, a detail most people would miss, but he would not. Since the ex-client he had burned in that messy split years ago had shown up after my quiet invitation and was now standing near the display, chatting with the interviewer in full view of the camera that was still rolling B-roll for later cuts. And I knew that if Jason watched even a minute past the close, he would clock her face and understand that there are bridges you do not have to rebuild when you learn how to build your own road. The event wrapped with handshakes and quick photos. The producer asked for a follow-up quote, and I gave one that was crisp and uncontroversial because I had already said the only sentence that mattered. And as I stepped off the small riser and glanced at my phone lighting up again, I understood that this wasn't going to be a one-day victory that fades by dinner. It was the kind of pivot that keeps moving after you stop pushing. And that realization, that the line had legs, that the clip would travel, that the rooms I had been knocking on might now open on their own, settled in with a steadiness I had not felt in a long time, the steadiness of someone who finally set the terms. And while I packed up and thanked everyone and answered a few more messages, I could feel the next beat forming on its own, because when momentum decides to cooperate, your job is to get out of its way and guide it without grabbing it too hard. Which is why I ignored the first text that buzzed from Jason's name and let it sit unread, not as a punishment but as a clear boundary, since the next conversation I planned to have would not be with him at all, but with the larger network that wanted me live in the morning, and if this snowball was finally rolling, I was going to make sure it hit the mountain at full speed. The clip had barely finished uploading before the familiar avalanche of alerts started to roll across my screen, not the vanity kind that give you a temporary sugar high and then evaporate, but the kind that actually change your calendar and your bank account because they come from people who want to meet, to buy, to partner, and to put you in rooms where you used to be the extra chair. And while I tried to keep my head straight and not get cocky, I could also tell that something fundamental had shifted, since the messages that used to open with advice now opened with respect, and the people who used to suggest I slow down now asked how they could keep up. Within a few hours, the local station posted a longer cut, and the segment editor threaded my closer into the caption, which meant the line about the moment being for me and not for the people who never believed sat right there under my face for anyone to share without adding commentary, and that tiny detail did more work for me than any speech ever could, because it let folks project their own experiences into it and speak for me in threads I did not have to enter. I heard from a podcast host I had pitched months ago and never heard back from, who said she had watched the clip twice and wanted to bring me on for a conversation about building through doubt. I heard from a mid-size retailer who had previously dismissed my product as niche and was suddenly eager to discuss a test order. I heard from a nonprofit director who said the line made her tear up because she knew exactly what it meant to be told to be grateful for scraps, and tucked between those Messages were quiet notes from people I barely knew, telling me they forwarded the video to a sister, a colleague, a teenage daughter, which then made the clip jump into circles I could never have reached on purpose. My parents finally chimed in on the family chat with a polite congratulations that had the flavor of a belated acknowledgement rather than a genuine celebration, something like "We saw you on television. Very impressive. Keep going." And even though I recognized the effort they were making to be supportive, I could not ignore that nobody had asked anything beforehand, nobody had offered help, and nobody had challenged Jason when he told me nobody cared. Jason, for his part, stayed quiet just long enough to make it awkward, and then sent me a one-liner that read like a shrug dressed up as encouragement, a tidy little nice work. Looks like it got some attention, which landed exactly the way he meant it to land. As if I had stumbled into a minor win that he could classify as lucky and therefore not threatening to the story he tells about me. I left it unread and put my focus where it belonged, on the second request that came from a national morning show producer who wanted me live the next day. And the way she framed it made me smile because she said the segment worked not just because of the product, but because I had the spine to say something true without naming names. And that was the signal I needed to keep leaning into the honesty without turning it into a messy family fight. As soon as we locked the slot, I reached out to the ex-client of Jason's I had invited to the launch and pitched her on a simple, mutually beneficial move: a public letter of intent to pilot my product inside her company's workflow, signed the same day, so I could mention it live as an example of adoption from a respected operator, which would do more to validate me than any compliment ever could. And she said yes immediately because she had been waiting for a way to make her support tangible. While that paperwork was being drafted, a business blog ran a short piece on the clip with a headline that made even me laugh from the clean sting of it, something along the lines of "Entrepreneur calls out doubters on live TV and turns a launch into a rallying cry." And although I usually hate those breathless write-ups, this one did me a favor by embedding the video and keeping the focus on the line rather than rehashing my background, which kept the energy right where I needed it. The comments under that article did what comments do, with a predictable mix of skeptics and cheerleaders, but scattered among them were tags that pulled in people from Jason's circles, old colleagues and industry acquaintances who, upon seeing the ex-client's name on the letter of intent I posted later that afternoon, started connecting dots without any nudging from me, and that was the precise effect I wanted, because it took the burden of explanation off my shoulders and placed it on the simple reality that decisions speak louder than family banter. Now, I promised myself that each step of this plan would carry a clean edge of satisfaction without crossing into petty, and there was one more move I had saved for a day like this. A move that did not break any rules yet would make any person who had told me that nobody cared feel the weight of their words reflected back in a way they could not ignore. I spun up a tiny, tightly targeted ad campaign on the professional network where Jason basically lives, not a smear, not even a mention of him by name, just a short clip of my closer and a link to a sign-up for a live demo, shown specifically to first-degree connections in his city and industry who matched the profile of the people who used to treat me like an eager intern, and because I wrote the copy in a tone that walked right up to the line and stopped, it came off not as an attack, but as proof that the demand was real, which is the one language his world respects. By the time the ad had run for a few hours, I started getting calendar pings from people whose surnames had once made me feel tiny, and I will not pretend that did not feel like justice, because it felt exactly like justice. When my parents called to say they were proud and asked if Jason had reached out, I told them the truth, that I had seen his message and had decided to respond after the morning show. Not because I wanted to be theatrical, but because I wanted to establish a new rhythm in which my work set the pace and family followed, and they were quiet for a beat in a way that told me they heard more than I said. Then the ex-client sent me the signed letter with a note that read, "Let's make this count," and I posted it with a simple caption thanking the people who believed early and the people who believed late, which is my way of saying that belief is welcome whenever it shows up. But the early kind carries a special place at the table. And as I set my alarm for a painfully early call time and watched the comments multiply under the post where the letter sat next to the clip, I could almost hear the ringtone I knew would come, because nothing accelerates a family apology like public proof. So when his name finally flashed on my screen, I let it ring through once and then pressed decline, not to be cruel, but to make space for the conversation that would happen on air in the morning, the one he could not edit. The one that would land in the inboxes of the same people who once laughed when I pitched them, and as I put my phone face down and closed my eyes, I knew I had set the stage for a call that would come before midnight, and when it did, I would answer on my terms. By the time the car from the studio dropped me back at my place after the morning show, where the segment producer surprised me by giving me the last word, and I used it to repeat with a steady voice that this moment was for me and not for the people who never believed. The day had already stretched into that strange version of time where minutes pile on top of each other, and you are answering messages and signing documents and trying to eat something while your phone refuses to stop lighting up. And in the middle of all that noise, I made one more move that I had kept tucked away for when the momentum felt undeniable, which was to send a short and calm email to the columnist who had covered me before, not asking for anything, just thanking her for her early interest, and including a quiet update that the pilot agreement was signed and the first retailer call was on the books. And I knew as I hit send that the way you treat the people who showed up early becomes part of your reputation, just as much as the sharp lines you deliver on camera. The piece she posted that afternoon did not flatter me so much as frame the story plainly, which was better, because it made the line feel earned and not manufactured, and it added one detail that I had not said out loud but was happy to have in print: that the product itself was good enough to stand on its own even if the family drama had never existed, which meant the victory would not evaporate when the clip fell off the trending lists. While that article started to circulate, my inbox caught another set of messages that pushed the day to a new level: a formal invitation to present at a conference I had watched for years from the sidelines, and a note from a brand that had passed on me last season now asking whether we could talk this week. And I kept my replies simple and clear because I did not want to sound like a person who had suddenly become someone else. But I will admit that when the calendar invites landed, I took a second to breathe and let the reality sink in that the room I had been banging on had finally opened, and I had walked through it without apologizing for the noise I made. My parents called again, and this time my mother's voice had a warmth in it that was not forced, and she said that my father had forwarded the clip to his old colleague who ran a mentoring program, and that they were both proud, and I thanked them, and because I wanted to change the pattern, I told them I would see them soon. But tonight I needed to leave my phone alone for a while, and they understood, which felt like a new kind of respect I had not had to negotiate for. Jason's name flashed on my screen just before dinner with a short text that tried to sound casual and landed like a hand on a hot stove, something about grabbing a drink to talk it through, and I did not respond. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed the conversation to happen in a way that would prevent him from doing the thing he always did, which was to turn a clean acknowledgement into a shared misunderstanding where everybody had a little fault and nobody had to change. I knew the apology I wanted was not a performance in a crowded room. It was a private, unedited sentence that belonged to me, and if he meant it, he would say it straight without staging the scene. So I let the evening roll on with the calls I had already scheduled. I signed the revised purchase order from the retailer. I checked in with the ex-client turned partner and made sure her operations lead had everything for the pilot start. And as the messages slowed into a steady hum, I set the phone face down and allowed myself a quiet half hour where I did not rehearse arguments or write speeches in my head, because I had already said what needed saying and the rest would be measured by actions. The FaceTime request came late enough that I knew he had watched more than one clip and probably read at least one thread where someone had tagged him, and I let it ring twice before I answered, not to play a game, but to give myself a beat to stay calm. And when his face appeared, there was none of the easy grin he uses when he thinks charm will smooth everything. There was only a tightness around his mouth that told me he had run out of ways to pretend that this was small. He started with the usual preamble that people use when they are working their way toward a confession, talking about how fast everything had moved and how he was surprised by the reach and how proud he was, and I listened without interrupting. because I wanted him to get to the part that mattered, and when he finally said that he was sorry for saying that nobody cared and that he had been wrong and that he had said it because it made him feel safer to see my work as something that could not outgrow his shadow, I let the silence sit there for a long second so the words could land, and then I told him that I accepted the apology and that I was not interested in replaying the old pattern where I made myself smaller so he could feel steady. He nodded in a way that looked like surrender and also like relief, and he asked if we could start over, and I said we could start clean as long as start clean meant he would not rewrite the last few days into a story where he was cheering the whole time. And his face tightened again, but he said he understood, and I believed him enough to end the call with a simple good night. The petty version of me wanted to keep a screenshot of his "nobody cares" text as a trophy, to remind myself not to forget the feeling, but the version of me that had done all this work knew that holding that small receipt would only anchor me to a smaller fight. So I deleted it, and, as a final move that felt as much like closure as like strategy, I opened the family chat and shared the link to the conference announcement with a short line that said I would be speaking in the fall and would appreciate anyone who wanted to be in the audience, and I left it there without tagging anyone by name, because the new rule was simple. If you want to stand next to me, you can buy a ticket, and if you do not, the door will not hit you on the way out. The replies rolled in with the kind of enthusiasm that arrives after the band has already started playing, and I let them be what they were without grading them. When the clock ticked into the last hour of the day and the air felt like a quiet room after a long meeting, I sat with the question that people will always ask at the end of a story like this: whether the line was too sharp, whether calling out the people who never believed was a bridge too far, and I found that I did not care to defend it, because it was not meant to punish anyone. It was meant to free me from narrating my life for the comfort of someone else's ego. And the results spoke for itself: partnerships in motion, invitations that had never arrived before, and a clear boundary that kept my center steady. Maybe Jason and I will be closer, or maybe we will just be more honest, and maybe my parents will keep learning how to support me without filtering everything through him, and maybe they will not, but none of those maybes change the simple finish. That I claimed the moment in public, I backed it with work in private, and I made the apology come to me without begging for it, which is the only kind of win I wanted.